Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to be speaking today on the topic of navigating financial toxicity, and my name is Joanna Morales, and I'm a cancer rights attorney by training and the CEO of Triage Cancer. And before I get started talking about the details of how to navigate financial toxicity and some key ways to avoid financial toxicity, I want to talk about some of the resources that Triage Cancer provides that I'm going to speak to throughout the presentation and where you can go for more information. So Triage Cancer, for those of you who don't know, is a national nonprofit organization that provides education on all of the practical and legal issues that may come up as a result of a cancer diagnosis. And that runs the gamut. And we do that through the hosting of educational events that are free. We host a series of conferences. The next one will be on October 3rd. We also host a free webinar series that covers a variety of different topics. In August, we're going to be talking about adulting. So all of the things that we need to do as adults that we don't really enjoy doing, like budgeting. But then we're also going to have a special webinar that talks about returning to work during COVID-19. And then we also have a series of quick guides and checklists that cover a variety of topics that may be useful to you. And because we know that not everybody learns in the same way, I happen to be a visual learner, we host a series of animated videos on a variety of topics that we think are important for people to understand. And then on our website, we also have a series of state resources and charts of state laws, because where you live matters in terms of what you have access to. We also host a separate website called cancerfinances.org. And on this website, we provide education on a variety of different topics that might impact someone's financial situation, but also provides connection to financial assistance resources. And so this is a very useful site for people to go on and answer questions based on their situation in particular, and then it tailors the content based on how you've answered those questions. So as we use the term financial toxicity, it's important to know that it's a relatively new term. So it was only coined by some researchers from Duke in 2013 to describe the financial impact of a cancer diagnosis on someone's life. And so even though financial toxicity is a relatively new term, it's not a new problem. I've been working in the cancer community for a few decades, and the high cost of cancer care is definitely something that has always been present. Now, this slide isn't meant for you to be able to read, but it's a visual representation of all of the questions that someone would need to ask and find answers to help avoid financial toxicity. And we have this quick guide available on our website in much greater detail, but it not only poses the questions, it also shares all of the resources that we provide to help you actually answer those questions. So that's a useful tool. Now, when we're talking about financial toxicity, there are actually a lot of contributors to financial toxicity, which is probably why it's very difficult for us to just solve as a problem. And we think that some of the biggest contributors to financial toxicity are having adequate health insurance coverage and understanding the potential loss of income for someone who's been diagnosed and is trying to work through treatment or to take time off. But certainly there are life changes as well that can impact your financial situation, the same as when they do normally. So getting married or divorced, if you're moving or graduating from school, those are all life changes that could have an impact on your financial situation. So today I'm just going to highlight mostly health insurance and having adequate coverage so that your out-of-pocket costs for care are as low as possible. And then I'm going to talk briefly about some of the employment and disability insurance options that are available as well. So jumping into health insurance is one of those things that I feel like should be taught in high school because it's something that everybody needs to understand, but very few people do. So if you feel like you don't understand your health insurance coverage, you're absolutely not alone. It's not just my anecdotal opinion. There's tons of data that show that even people who have health insurance coverage don't necessarily understand what they're paying for it, how to file claims, the terms of their policy. So I want to talk through some of the key things that really everyone should understand about their health insurance coverage, because it's an effective way to shop for health insurance and make changes on an annual basis so that you're actually lowering your out-of-pocket costs. So when we talk about health insurance in the United States, there's actually only 3 places where you go for health insurance coverage. You're either getting it directly from an insurance company, or you're getting it through the government. And by that, I mean Medicare, Medicaid, military or veterans plans, state high-risk pools, or some local programs, or you're getting it through your employer. And still about 50% of people in the United States get their health insurance coverage through their employer. So there are some key terms that everyone should understand about their coverage. There are costs that we pay just to have health insurance, and that's typically something that we pay each month that we call a monthly premium. But then there are costs that we pay when we get certain types of care, even if we have health insurance. So first we pay our annual deductible, which is a fixed dollar amount. So it's a specific amount of money that you pay first before your health insurance coverage even kicks in. So you might have a $500 deductible, or you might have a $5,000 deductible, or you might even have a $0 deductible, depending on the type of coverage that you have. And then there's something called a copayment. And this is something that you pay when you get certain types of care and is also a fixed dollar amount. So you might have a $10 copayment to go into the doctor's office, or you might have a $40 copayment to see a specialist, or a $200 copayment if you walk into the emergency room. And that's different from coinsurance or cost share. And those are 2 terms that are used the same way. So it's a percentage. It's the difference between what insurance companies pay for your medical expenses versus what you pay for your medical expenses. So you're literally sharing the cost. And if you have an 80-20 cost share, for example, the insurance company is paying 80% of those medical expenses and you're responsible for 20%. And then there's something called an out-of-pocket maximum. And I think this is probably the most important thing that people need to know about their health insurance coverage. It's a specific dollar amount that when you reach that dollar amount in out-of-pocket costs, the insurance kicks in and pays 100% of your medical expenses for the rest of the year. And the way that you reach your out-of-pocket maximum is actually a math problem. So first you add up your deductible plus any co-payments that you make, plus any coinsurance amounts that you make. And when you reach your out-of-pocket maximum again, your insurance kicks in at 100% for the rest of the year. So to give you an example of how this actually works in real life, David has just spent a week in the hospital, and he has a plan that has a $2,000 deductible. It's an 80-20 plan, and he has a $4,000 out-of-pocket maximum. He walks out of the hospital with a $102,000 hospital bill. Assuming he's had no other medical expenses during the year, how much does he actually have to pay of that hospital? So first he's going to pay his $2,000 deductible, which leaves $100,000 left of the bill. So he has an 80-20 plan, meaning the insurance company is going to pay for 80% and he's responsible for 20%. Which leaves him with another $20,000 that he has to pay. But he has an out-of-pocket maximum that's $4,000, and he's already paid a $2,000 deductible. So he only has to pay an additional $2,000 of that $20,000 bill, and then he'll have reached his out-of-pocket maximum. So his insurance will kick in and pick up the rest of that $20,000 bill. So I'm certainly not suggesting that $4,000 isn't a lot of money, but it does put a maximum amount on what someone has to pay out of pocket. So in a worst case scenario, you can plan around that number. And it's certainly better than the $102,000 hospital bill that he started out with. Now, under the Affordable Care Act, there were a number of consumer protections that have had a significant benefit for the cancer community. And the first is that insurance companies are no longer allowed to cancel your policy when you try to use it. And that sounds like something that would never happen, but was happening so often that at the time that the ACA was signed into law, there were a number of states that were trying to address this at the state level. So as long as you don't commit fraud on your application, an insurance company can't cancel your policy. Insurance companies are also no longer allowed to impose annual or lifetime limits on the essential benefits of your policy. So previously, we would see people with a $75,000 annual limit or even a $1 million lifetime limit on a policy is actually not hard to reach when we're talking about expensive medical conditions like cancer care or other chronic conditions where there's ongoing need for care. The ACA also said that young adults can stay on their parents' health insurance plan until they turn 26. It's just based on age. You no longer have to be a full-time student or a dependent under IRS standards. Even if that young adult is married, they can still stay on their parents' plan until they turn 26. The ACA also gave people access to free preventive services, meaning that when you go and get one of these services, it's entirely free, zero out-of-pocket cost. So you don't pay a copayment, you don't pay a coinsurance amount, and you don't pay a deductible amount. And it's a specific list of services that you can find on healthcare.gov, but they're all the things that you would expect in an annual checkup. So blood pressure testing, immunizations, cholesterol, cancer screenings, all of those things you should receive at zero out-of-pocket cost. The ACA also required insurance companies to cover the routine costs of when patients participate in a clinical trial. So previously, insurance companies would say, if you want to participate in a clinical trial, that's fine, but we're not covering anything related to your care. Meaning that patients would have to pay out of pocket for those routine costs that would have been covered if they'd gotten standard of care. And now insurance companies across the country are required to cover those routine costs. And those include things like office visits and blood work and imaging scans and any of the other types of treatment that would have been part of that standard of care. And typically, the things that aren't being covered or included in those routine costs are covered by the trial. So the actual drug or treatment or procedure being tested in the clinical trial is typically covered by the trial. And then the ACA said that sometimes insurance companies deny things they shouldn't. And that brings us to the issue of appeals. So when an insurance company denies coverage for a particular treatment or drug or surgery, you can appeal that decision. And there is two types of appeals. There are internal appeals inside your insurance company, and sometimes there are one or two levels of internal appeals. But if an insurance company still says no, you can actually ask for what's called external or independent medical review. And the ACA made this federal law, so this is available in every state, where you get to go outside the insurance company to an independent review organization who's going to review your claim to see if it's medically necessary. On the Triage Cancer website, we have the contact information for every state's health insurance agency that actually manages this process. But I think that this is actually one of the best kept secrets of our healthcare system. And it's not just my opinion. I now have the data to back it up, because in 2017, there were more than 42 million claims denied by health insurance companies, but only 0.5% of those claims were appealed. So less than 200,000 appeals were filed in 2017. So when you think about when someone is denied care, the external review process, about 50% of the time on average, is overturning those denials. So 50% of the time, insurance companies are getting it wrong, which means that of these 42 million claims, 50% of those probably should have been covered by the insurance company, which means that patients are either not getting the care that they needed because they can't afford to pay for it out of pocket, or they're paying for it out of pocket. And that's only contributing to financial toxicity. So it's incredibly important that if you are facing a denial of care, that you go through the appeals process and don't take no for an answer. Now, the ACA also did two things that I think, if there was nothing else in the ACA, would still have been game-changing for the cancer community. The first being that it changed the way that insurance companies decide how much to charge us for a policy. And that process is called premium rate. Whether or not you're buying a policy for an individual or family, because if you're covering more people, they can charge you more. Where you live based on your zip code, your age, but they capped how much more you can get charged as you get older, and whether or not you use tobacco. So if you use tobacco, you can be charged more for coverage, but some states went ahead and eliminated this piece as well, like California and DC. So no longer can they take into consideration pre-existing condition or health history or gender. Women have always been charged more than men for health insurance coverage, and that's no longer allowed. And then the ACA went one step further, and it said insurance companies can no longer deny people coverage based on their age, their gender, where they live, their pre-existing conditions, or really any other reason. As long as you can afford the policy, they have to provide it to you. So when we talk about pre-existing condition protections, there's a lot of focus on this second piece, but this second piece isn't really a protection unless it also comes with the first piece, because the first piece is what keeps cost in check. So it's not really saying I have access if you can charge me whatever you want for that policy. So it's very important that when we talk about protecting pre-existing condition protections, that we talk about both of these things together. Now, that said, there's been a lot of challenges to the ACA and the consumer protections that are in the ACA. And the most recent challenge is a court case that is currently at the Supreme Court called California versus Texas. And it has been working its way through the court system for the last 2.5 years. It is unlikely that we are going to get a result in this case until after the election, because the Supreme Court hasn't scheduled a hearing in this case yet. But ultimately, if the Supreme Court could decide to either uphold the ACA, uphold part of the ACA, or strike the whole thing down. And the Department of Justice is currently arguing to strike the whole thing down, along with about half the states who were part of this original case. So if you want more information about this case, we talk about it in our educational blog. But I mention it because all of these consumer protections that I just talked about could potentially go away within the next year. So one of the benefits to that pre-existing condition protection is that now every single year we can make changes to our health insurance coverage. If we have an employer plan that gives us choices, or we have an individual plan or Medicare, we can actually make educated decisions as consumers to try to lower our out-of-pocket costs. So even if you have a plan now that has a very high deductible and high out-of-pocket costs, you can be a strategic consumer to lower those out-of-pocket costs moving forward. And I'm going to give you some examples of how to do that. So when we're talking about Medicare specifically, there's different parts of Medicare coverage. And there's these two different lanes that you can drive down in Medicare. And depending on which lane you pick, it could significantly change how much you pay for your health care. But with Medicare, you can actually change lanes every single year during open enrollment. And open enrollment every single year for Medicare is from October 15th to December 7th. So you can drive back and forth between these two lanes to make sure that depending on what your healthcare needs are, you have a plan that is going to actually cover your needs and provide the lowest out-of-pocket costs. Now, I don't get the opportunity to spend a lot of time with you today, and I could probably spend 8 hours just talking about Medicare. So I want you to know that we have a ton of resources on Medicare to help people navigate those choices, including an hour-long webinar that's recorded, but we also have one coming up in September right before the next Medicare open enrollment period. And then we have a number of resources to help you understand the different choices that you can make in Medicare to lower your out-of-pocket costs. Now, Medicaid is the other federal health insurance program that prior to January 1st of 2014 was only available to individuals who had a low income level, a low resource level, and met some other category of eligibility. So there were these different doors into the Medicaid program. Most of the time in the cancer community, people could only access the door on the left after getting qualified as having a disability by the Social Security Administration. So those were a lot of hoops to jump through to actually get access to healthcare through Medicaid. So the ACA actually created a new door into the Medicaid program for anyone with a household income up to 138% of the federal poverty level. So this year, that's $17,609 for an individual. So the old doors still exist into the Medicaid program, but only this new door is just based on income. It's not based on resources or any other hoops that you have to jump through. It's just based on your income level. Now, the ACA made it mandatory for every state to expand access to their program, but then the Supreme Court got their hands on the Affordable Care Act and they made it voluntary for states to participate. So as of today, this is what it looks like. The states on the left have expanded access to their programs and the states on the right have chosen not to. I usually say this earlier when I'm speaking, is that these slides are only good for today. This information changes frequently, but this slide is probably the one that changes the most often. And you can see all the footnotes at the bottom. And the reason why is that states and state legislatures and state governors are constantly making decisions that change access to healthcare. And just a few weeks ago, Oklahoma actually passed a voter proposition where the voters in the state asked their state, or required their state, I should say, to expand access to the Medicaid program in Oklahoma, but it won't go into effect for a while. The states on the right represent about 3 to 5 million people who would have gotten access to healthcare but haven't yet because their states have chosen not to expand. Now, when I talk about Medicaid to audiences, I sometimes get asked, well, why do I care about Medicaid if I have an employer plan, for example? And the reason why is that not only does Medicaid cover some of our most vulnerable populations, but it also has an impact on everyone. And we have some really interesting data that shows that in states that expanded Medicaid, the private health insurance premiums are actually lower on average 7%. But we also know that uncompensated care that hospitals are paying for because people don't have Medicaid and don't have another form of insurance is rising exponentially. And hospitals are facing the decisions to either close their hospital entirely or close their emergency rooms. And even if you have the best health insurance in the world, if that hospital isn't there anymore or that emergency room isn't there anymore and you have an emergency, that affects all of us. So sometimes these policy decisions are talked about in a vacuum and we don't necessarily see the domino effect that they can have on everything in our healthcare system. And that's just one example. There is a second best kept secret of our healthcare system that I want to share that's pretty timely, because we know that so many people have had to file for unemployment because they've lost their jobs recently, and they could have potentially lost access to their employer-sponsored coverage. COBRA, unfortunately, while it allows you to keep your employer plan, can be very expensive. The Health Insurance Premium Payment Program, or HIP, is a state program through Medicaid where the state Medicaid program will pay your private employer-sponsored premiums for you rather than pay for all of your care through Medicaid if you qualify for Medicaid in your state. So this isn't available in every state. It's an optional program that the state Medicaid program offers, but this could be an incredibly useful way to help pay for your COBRA premiums, or if you have access to an employer-sponsored plan where you're having trouble paying the premiums. So we have the contact information for the states that have this program on our website. So in addition to Medicare and Medicaid, for people who need to purchase an individual health insurance plan, there is something called the state health insurance marketplaces that were created by the ACA. And effectively, they're like an insurance shopping mall. It's one place where you can go to find all of your private health insurance options available to you based on where you live. But there are some benefits to actually buying a plan through the marketplace. And the first is that there's a cap on the out-of-pocket maximum for all the plans sold in the marketplace. So this year, the cap can't be more than $8,200, which is significantly more than it has been in the past. But it's still a lot lower than what I've seen in some employer plans, which I've seen up to $20,000 of an out-of-pocket maximum. There is also financial assistance available, and there's two types. There are premium tax credits, which lower your monthly premium based on whichever plan you pick and your household income. And then there's something called a cost-sharing subsidy, which lowers your out-of-pocket costs, such as your deductibles, your copays, and your cost share amounts. One of the other advantages to buying a plan through the marketplace is that it's standardized. So you can actually compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, and allows us as consumers to make more educated decisions. And the way that the plans are standardized is through their cost share. So the lowest level of coverage is actually the bronze plan, and that's a 60-40 plan. Silver is 70-30, gold is 80-20, and platinum is 90-10. So there is a level of coverage called catastrophic coverage for young adults under the age of 30, but I really wouldn't recommend that anyone look at catastrophic coverage because it's not a full scope health insurance plan where the metal level plans are. So this is what it looks like based on household income if you're in a state that expanded Medicaid. So if you have a household income up to 138% of the federal poverty level, you get access to Medicaid in your state. If you're between 138 and 250% of the federal poverty level, you have access both to the premium tax credits and the cost sharing subsidies. And then if you are up between 250 and 400% of the federal poverty level, you have access just to the premium tax credits. So the bottom line is that if you have a family of four making under $100,000 a year, you're getting access to some type of financial assistance to buy your plan in the marketplace. Now, some states have gone further. This year, for the first time in California, they expanded premium tax credits for people between 400 and 600% of the federal poverty level. So there might be additional resources available to you at the state level. For states that didn't expand, you lose access to this Medicaid option. So it significantly causes a gap in access to coverage because you might have someone at 120% of the federal poverty level not getting any help, but someone at 350% of the federal poverty level getting help. But the ACA didn't anticipate that gap because that gap was filled by Medicaid. So there are only certain times of year where you can enroll in coverage, except for Medicaid, where applications are accepted year-round. For the marketplace enrollment for a 2020 plan, it is closed, but you might qualify for a special enrollment period. And losing employer-sponsored coverage is a special enrollment opportunity. And we have an entire quick guide on what happens in that moment. For 2021, the open enrollment period will start in November and go to the middle of December. If a state runs its own marketplace, it might have different dates and it might be open longer. So for example, in California and DC, the marketplace is actually open right now. So if you need health insurance coverage, you can go to the marketplace. Medicare open enrollment, as I mentioned before, is October 15th to December 7th every year. And if your employer gives you options for health insurance coverage, open enrollment can be any time of the year based on when they renew their plan. But for most people, if the plan year starts in January, open enrollment is going to be in the fall. So I want to walk you through a quick exercise on how to actually compare your plan choices. And this exercise works if you are comparing two different marketplace plans, or if you're comparing two options that your employer gives you, or you can compare what your employer gives you to the marketplace, or you can compare your Medicare plan choices using this exercise. So these are three different plans. So there's a bronze plan at $173 a month, but has a $6,000 deductible and a $6,000 out-of-pocket maximum. There's a silver plan at $271 a month with a $2,500 deductible and a $5,200 out-of-pocket maximum. And then there's a platinum level plan at $398 a month with a $0 deductible and an $1,150 out-of-pocket maximum. So just by looking at these plans, you can't tell how much they're actually going to cost you by the end of the year, assuming that you're going to hit your out-of-pocket maximum, which is an important piece of this conversation, because when we're talking about cancer care, the chances of you hitting your out-of-pocket maximum is pretty high during the year. So you need to be thinking about how to take that into account when making choices. But you can't tell just by looking at them. You actually have to do the math. And the way that you do the math is that you take the monthly premium and you multiply it by 12, because that's how much it's going to cost you to have the plan for the year. And then you add that to the out-of-pocket maximum, because that's the most that you're going to pay out of pocket for your medical expenses during the year. So in this particular example, the platinum level plan is actually the least expensive, even though we get sticker shock when we look at that monthly premium because it seems so much higher than the other two plans. But it also has the lowest out-of-pocket maximum. So we do this exercise all over the country with different examples, and it never comes out the same. So it's always going to be based on the numbers, and you actually have to do the math to see which plan is going to be least expensive. But this is an incredibly effective tool to figure out how much a plan will actually cost you by year end. And what I just walked you through is actually in one of our animated videos. So if you know someone who could benefit from understanding that, you can point them to our animated videos. But it isn't just about cost. When you're looking for a plan, you also need to make sure that it's going to actually work for you, that it covers your providers and the hospitals that you go to and the prescription drugs that you take. And I know that sometimes that sounds obvious, but it isn't obvious to everybody. And understanding how insurance companies cover specific providers and specific prescription drugs is key to this process of how to keep your out-of-pocket costs lower. So I mentioned that when someone loses their employer-sponsored plan, they have multiple options, and there are different lanes that you can drive down. So the first one is you might be eligible for COBRA or state COBRA, depending on the size of your employer. You could also drive down the lane of marketplace special enrollment. So you are qualifying for that special enrollment period in the marketplace. You might also be able to move to another plan. So does your spouse have a plan through their employer? Could you move to that plan? If you're a young adult under the age of 26, could you go back to your parents' plan? Or could you qualify for Medicaid or Medicare? So now there are these different lanes that you could drive down that didn't exist previously when someone lost their coverage. And we have a quick guide that talks through the details of how to compare these options and make the best choice for you. And there's rules. So once you pick a lane, you actually have to stay in that lane. You can't change lanes. So if you pick Cobra and then 3 months later you decide Cobra is too expensive, you can't move to the marketplace lane until open enrollment for that marketplace plan. So it's important to understand the rules about making these choices and how long you're actually going to be stuck with some of these choices. So you want to make sure it's the best choice for you when you make that choice. So shifting for a minute away from health insurance, I want to talk a little bit about employment, because one of the most significant impacts on someone's financial situation is loss of income from working. So there are laws that provide protections for someone who wants or needs to work through treatment or to take time off. And then if someone is taking time off, how to access wage replacement options like disability insurance. So there are lots of different places to go for information about your employment rights. There are things that we call fair employment laws, which protect you against discrimination in the workplace based on your medical condition, but also give you access to reasonable accommodations. And those fair employment laws exist at the federal level, like the Americans with Disabilities Act or ADA, but they also exist at the state level. And it's really important to remember that the federal law is there and applies in every state, but sometimes states also have laws that apply to a situation that might be better than federal law. So you don't just want to be paying attention to your federal rights, but also looking specifically at your state law options. And then there are laws that we refer to as leave laws. And these laws actually allow you to take time off work and protect access to your job, and sometimes also access to your health insurance benefits. And again, they exist at the federal level as well as the state level. So at the federal level, we have the Family and Medical Leave Act. Some states have an FMLA version, but there are other state laws, like is there a paid sick leave law at the state level? And again, we keep track of all of this information on our chart of state laws. It's also important to remember that if you work under an employment contract or you're a member of a union, you actually are also covered by those contracts and might have additional rights and protections given to you under those contracts. So you need to be paying attention to those documents as well. And then we forget that the law just provides a bare minimum of what employers have to do. There are so many employers that go above and beyond what the law requires them to do. And so that information could be in an employee manual or some type of handbook or some type of policies and procedures document. But it's really important that you know where that is or how to access that information, because it's going to tell you information like what types of benefits you have access to. Do you have access to sick days or vacation time? Are there specific policies like your coworkers can donate their time to you? And so understanding those specific nuances of what your employer offers can be very helpful. And then for someone who needs to actually take time off, disability insurance is the primary way to replace lost wages. And there are lots of different types of disability insurance. So there are private disability insurance options that are short-term and long-term, meaning short-term policies typically last for up to a year, whereas long-term disability policies are typically for a year or longer. And these private disability insurance policies are policies that you can buy directly from an insurance company, but very few people do that proactively. And once you have a pre-existing medical condition, it's very difficult to buy a disability insurance policy. So most people that have access to disability insurance get it through their employer as part of an employee benefits package. And I can't tell you the number of people over the years who have said, oh, I don't have that. And I sent them back to their employee manual, and it turns out that they do, because it was just a piece of paper they signed on their first day of work, and they threw it in a drawer in their desk, and they forgot all about it because the employer pays the monthly premiums. So it's definitely worth checking to see if this is something that you have access to at work. And then there are a handful of states that actually provide state disability insurance benefits that we pay into as part of our payroll taxes. So that only includes California, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. So if you live in one of those 5 states or Puerto Rico, you can get access to a state disability insurance plan that lasts up to a year. And then there are the 2 federal long-term disability programs. So there's the Social Security Disability Insurance Program, which is SSDI, and there's Supplemental Security Income, which is SSI. And these programs are both run through the Social Security Administration. But they're only for people who have medical conditions that are expected to last a year or longer. Now, we have an endless number of resources about disability insurance, including an hour-long webinar that we just did a few months ago that's on our website that you can watch the recording of at any time. And we also have a number of resources on employment and disability insurance on our website. We have resources broken down by topic that you can find there. So with that, I am going to turn to some questions that people are asking. So there's a question about Medicaid coverage. If you're a family of 3, but you're the individual who's solely responsible paying for your medical bills, does that change Medicaid coverage? So Medicaid eligibility is based on household income and the number of people in your household. So if you're a family who qualifies for coverage, excuse me, the more people in your household, it actually spreads out your income level. So it actually makes it a little bit easier to qualify for Medicaid coverage, but that does depend on the state in which you live. So there's a question about whether or not parents can be added as dependents on an individual's insurance coverage. And that's actually pretty rare. The only time I've ever heard of that is where there was a really generous employer that had a very broad definition of dependence, but otherwise that's not typically something that happens because usually parents are filing their own taxes, they're not part of your immediate household, and then they can't actually qualify for health insurance with you. There's a question about how it works if you have 2 types of health insurance coverage, and is that actually a good thing to have? And it actually can be. So if you have an 80-20 plan, where your first plan covers 80% and you're responsible for 20%, that second plan could kick in and pick up that additional 20%. So sometimes plans can work very well together. Sometimes it creates some practical problems where the plans argue over who should be the first payer and who should be the second payer. So primary versus secondary payers, but it's usually laid out in the plan documents of how they're supposed to pay. And if you were in a situation where they are arguing over who pays, then talking with the state health insurance agency can actually be very helpful. Having 2 plans can also be very useful if you have one plan that doesn't cover your providers, certain providers, and another plan that does, because then you have that dual amount of coverage. So it can actually be very useful. So there's a question about if you have a disability, can you get SSI if you don't have disability insurance? SSI is supplemental security income. You don't have to buy it ahead of time. It's a federal benefit where if your income is low enough and you have a low enough resource level and you have a disability that qualifies you, then you can get access to SSI benefits. And I would again point you, if you have a lot more questions about SSI, to check out that webinar on our website on disability insurance. So there's a question about whether individuals who are not citizens and living in the United States can purchase in the marketplace. And it depends. So if you have, if you are a lawful permanent resident, so if you have a green card, or if you're otherwise legally present in the US, which includes all sorts of categories of visa holders. So if you have a work visa or a student visa, you can actually buy plans in the marketplace and qualify for assistance. And then there's a question about prescription drugs and the out-of-pocket maximum. So the example that I gave was about someone in the hospital, but it is possible that a plan that isn't in the marketplace, so maybe an employer plan, could have a separate deductible, copay amount, coinsurance amount, and out-of-pocket maximum for prescription drugs. So that when you're doing the math to see how much the plan is going to cost you, you'll have to add up the monthly premium plus the out-of-pocket maximum for your medical care, plus the out-of-pocket maximum for your prescription drugs. But again, marketplace plans aren't allowed to separate them, but I have seen that in some employer plans. So you would want to actually take a look at all three of those numbers. And then there was a question about how do you apply for Medicaid? You're going to do that at the state level. You can go directly to a state Medicaid office, and that contact information is on our state resources page. But you could actually also start at the marketplace. So the first couple of questions when looking at your plans that are available to you in the marketplace is going to ask you about your income level. So if your income level is low enough to qualify you for Medicaid, it's going to tell you that. So you can actually start at the marketplace, where if you start at healthcare.gov and answer some questions about your household size and your household income, it will tell you if you're eligible for Medicaid and then point you towards the Medicaid application in your state. So there's a question about when insurance companies deny services, are they legally required to inform both the patient and the provider of their decision and reason? They are absolutely required to inform the patient because it's the patient who holds the policy. Sometimes we see providers who are submitting the claims on behalf of patients, they might get information back from the insurance company faster than the patient does. But it's ultimately the patient who should get that information. So there's a question about once you meet your out-of-pocket maximum, do you still pay the copays for office visits? This is a fantastic question because the answer is no. But when you walk into the doctor's office, they might not have an updated information on whether or not you've met your out-of-pocket maximum. So this is something that you need to be keeping track of so that if you've met your out-of-pocket maximum, and you walk into your doctor's office and the person at the front desk asks for your copay, you can say, I've already met my out-of-pocket maximum. I'm not responsible for copays. You might hear back, well, we don't have any record of that. We're not sure of that. And your response, you can absolutely bill that to me if it turns out that I'm responsible for that copayment. But this happens pretty frequently because people sitting at the front desk of a doctor's office often don't have the most up-to-date information, which is why it's so important for patients to keep track of it, of themselves, because granted, it's one more thing that you're burdened with of keeping track of, but it can actually save you a lot of money and keep you from the situation where you have to go back to your doctor's office and try to get reimbursed that money that you've paid out unnecessarily. Forgive me while I just read through some of the other questions that have come through to make sure I've gotten them all. There's a question about understanding long-term disability benefits versus retiring versus working part-time. And there are actually a lot of nuances to this because it really depends on the type of disability insurance we're talking about and where someone is at in the disability insurance process and where they're retiring from. So if we're talking about Social Security retirement, if someone is interested in applying for SSDI, for example, SSDI is like getting access to your Social Security retirement benefits early because you have a disability. So once you start receiving SSDI, you can't also get your retirement benefits from Social Security because it's the same pool of money. Now, if someone has access to a private long-term disability policy and then is on those disability benefits and then wants to retire under Social Security's benefits, that is theoretically possible where you could be getting those benefits at the same time. But there's definitely some exceptions to the rule and some nuance to that. There's a question about the cost of services that a hospital or a doctor might charge is often a lot higher than when Medicare will actually pay. So is it practical for patients to actually negotiate a Medicare rate if they have to pay a bill themselves? You can certainly try. I think anyone who is going to pay out of pocket for medical care should negotiate with providers for the lowest cost of those services. Oftentimes for patients who are paying cash for care, it's actually the highest amount that someone's going to have to pay out of pocket. And so it's definitely worth having conversations to see what the options are for negotiating lower costs up front, but then also once bills come to talk about negotiating bills down or potentially working out payment plans. There's a question about insurance companies and contacting the insurance company prior to a CT or MRI. And I would actually say I definitely need more information to be able to answer your question. So if you would like to send me an email with any questions that you might have, you can do that by emailing me at info@triagecancer.org. So I'm just going to pause for a minute to see if there are any other questions that have come through. I think I've answered all of them in the chat box. And I'll just remind everyone that this was a high-level overview of some of the things that we think can have a significant impact on avoiding financial toxicity and to try to lower the out-of-pocket costs associated with cancer care. But we have a significant number of other resources that goes into more depth into these topics. So I would point you back to our website at triagecancer.org. And a great question to end up this session. If the ACA is struck down, what should patients do moving forward? And I unfortunately do not have a good answer to that question. I remember teaching health insurance before the ACA, and the ACA was such a game changer for the cancer community. It's hard for me to think about going backwards. However, The ACA has had such an in-depth impact on every area of our healthcare system that rolling it back is not going to be easy. And so I think that it is important to understand what's actually in the ACA versus what you might hear from friends and neighbors, but to really get the facts about what's in the law and what's not in the law. And to be really educated when looking at your options for health insurance coverage, keeping in mind that some of these things are going to go away if the ACA is struck down in whole or in part. If it gets struck down in part, the parts that will go away are those consumer protections. And so then it will be left to Congress and whoever is our next president to decide how to actually balance out the imbalance that will be created in our healthcare system if those consumer protections go away. So with that, I think that my time is up, as I'm just checking the clock. So I'm going to turn it over to our next presenter.